So good morning, everyone. Thanks for the great turnout. And I'm cognizant that this is a highly educated crowd that's very much aware of the problem of climate change. And so in thinking of what would be the most effective thing to do as an 8-minute presentation, I thought I'd just take the opportunity to kind of highlight 5 core theses with the intention of contextualizing the following presentations by my colleagues on this panel. So the first has to do with recognizing our own individual contributions to this problem. Why? Because there's no moral basis for calling for social change if we aren't ready to acknowledge our own problematic actions. See, there seems to be a issue. Maybe it's not working. The slides are not moving along. We'll figure that out. The screenshot, this screenshot here of ITAO's flight carbon calculator shows my personal one-way flight to Regina generated about 5,800 kilograms of carbon dioxide. The return flight will produce 6,700 kilograms, which on a per-person basis means I'm personally emitting 482.2 kilograms of carbon dioxide just to fly here and back home for a 3-day conference. To put this in perspective, that's the equivalent of the average energy needs of a typical North American household for nearly 14 days, or burning 154 kilograms of coal, which I've actually tried to calculate and give, in sort of spatial terms. This is about enough coal to fill a 7 cubic feet chest freezer full, just for me to fly here for a couple days. So I admit, I'm clearly part of this problem, and it's a little bit odd to be speaking about this after flying here. So I also want to emphasize that we're all playing, the next slide, we're all playing a role in this problem together. So if we assume that my voyage to Congress is, from Ottawa is around the average distance traveled, and we multiply that by 8,000 typical Congress attendees, although I understand Regina is probably more around 5,000, we could see why these massive conferences are such a problem. If we had all stayed home, for instance, we could have saved enough energy to power almost 417 households, and you can go to the next slide, for a full year, or in terms of GHG emissions, we could have taken the equivalent of 826 cars off the road, or left 8,931 barrels of oil in the ground. That's assuming, I'll make a number of assumptions, but again, that's just from transportation and aviation emissions. We also have to, and you can click it one more time here, we have to consider the emissions that normally would have, that wouldn't have normally occurred if we had stayed home, namely the energy required to accommodate us at our hotels, the provision of commodities and services that we wouldn't have required at home, for instance, all the food packaging that we're going to consume at this conference that one would hope we wouldn't have consumed at home. So we're all in this together, folks. I also want to, the second sort of thesis, thank you, is that while there's an assumption out there that new technologies will help us solve the problem of climate change, I want to use these 2 recent figures of energy use and projected emissions to demonstrate that the real problem isn't necessarily one of contemporarily inefficient technologies, but it's a consumption problem. We can see here that despite coal use having peaked in 2014, it's still an enormous amount, and the amount of oil and gas that we are using is actually on an upward trajectory still since 2000. So all while we're supposed to be reducing our use of fossil fuels, and this is why our current climate policies put us woefully short of IPCC objectives, as you're all familiar with. As a case in point, and Simon will probably talk more about this, the aviation industry talks about new technologies and innovations like new lightweight aircraft, using biofuels, carbon offsets. But while these technologies may, or in the case of offsets may not, improve emissions on a per flight or per person basis, the problem, and you can go to the next slide, the problem is that we are flying more than ever before. And as you can see here, humans are expected to double their consumption of aviation over the next 15 years. The takeaway here is that we have a consumption problem. We can't just take the word of the aviation industry or the hospitality industry that they're taking steps to introduce new innovations and technologies that'll help make these sectors more sustainable. We need to consume less of these things. I realize that in academic terms, that's a real problem. We face a lot of pressure to attend academic conferences. As a tenure-track professor, I feel a lot of pressure to attend the ISA, the International Studies Association conference on an annual basis, these sort of large field-defining conferences. But to use a sport analogy, we don't hold the FIFA World Cup every year. So perhaps there's room to tackle the norms, in academic norms regarding how we ought to participate and how often we ought to participate in these sort of field-defining conferences abroad to disseminate our groundbreaking research. Maybe once every 2 or 3 years is enough to do that. And then on the interim, we can go to regional conferences that we don't have to fly to. Next slide. It's 2 slides now. When it comes to tackling norms, I think we'll have to be really strategic and calculated about our messaging so that we don't turn people off by making them feel like they're being chastised. The literature on norms tells us that it's absolutely crucial that people who do cut back on academic travel feel a sense of pride for doing so, for contributing to the common good, and not feel like a sucker, because if they feel like a sucker, there's a chance of a boomerang effect where they end up going and traveling more than they would have originally. So in strategic terms, we need to be leveraging what in the literature is called norm-based interventions. And that's that later. The research also tells us that there are different stages involved in the formation of new norms. We're very much in the early stages of this effort. These ideas are just being put on the table, events like this. So we basically are seeing, and you can click again, we see a few norm entrepreneurs, a small collection of efforts trying to persuade people to jump on board to this idea of flying less, thinking about our carbon footprint at academic conferences. But it's only a matter of time before we reach a tipping point. If we keep pushing and we keep persevering, we will reach a tipping point, and then we see that cascade of shifting norms. Next slide, please. As a final point, we really need to be thinking creatively about this problem at an institutional level. It's too much to expect that as individuals alone we can foment this type of shift in norms. We need to ask ourselves, what policies can the university, can an association like ESAC, can the federation adopt to help encourage new norms along, around long-distance academic travel? And I think we'll be hearing more about some of these sort of institutional level efforts in Peter's presentation right along time here. So to sum up, my 5 sort of core theses here: we need the unsustainable quality of academic conference culture and the role we collectively play in fueling this problem. 2, we can't rely on new technologies and products to solve this problem. We can address this problem by consuming less conferences. 3rd, a key focus should be changing norms around international travel for academic conferences through strategic messaging. 4th, we need to play the long game here and not get discouraged by the slow pace of change. We need to keep at it. And finally, individual action is key, but we also need institutional responses to help us deal with this collective action problem. Yeah. I'm done.